Thank you for joining the National Institute for Demographic Studies in France's Monday's lecture series. Today's presentations are organized by the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. Our secretariat is housed at INED on the Condorcet campus in Aubervilliers. And today's lecture features members of the IUSSP scientific panel on contraceptive transition theories, who have just recently published the results of their panel's work in a special issue of the Population and Development Review. The title of the presentation is Contraceptive Transitions, Some Highlights from a New Review of Evidence. And our speakers today are John Casterline from The Ohio State University. He was chair of the panel. Nathalie Sawadogo, who's at Ki-Zerbo University in Ouagadougou, and she'll be speaking in French. And Jamaica Corker, who'll be presenting in English, and she's based at the University of Washington Center for the Study of Demography and Ecology. And Heini Vaïsänen from INED will be the discussant. She's with the DemoSud Research Unit and with the Sexual and Reproductive Health Unit. So with that, since we have only about 30 to 40 minutes for the presentations, I'm going to turn everything over to the presenters.
So, Mary Ellen, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to INED for this opportunity, which we really welcome. What we're going to do today is just give you a small taste of what we have in this supplement to Population Development Review, which was published just a few months ago. Next slide, please, Mary Ellen.
Oops, there.
So here's an outline of what we're going to do. We'll first of all give you some background, the genesis and mandate of the ISSP scientific panel, which was which managed the publication of this PDR supplement. Some challenges we faced in doing our work as a panel in achieving our scientific aims. And then we've selected three themes that cross a number of the essays. And there's three of them in the bullet points here, and we'll touch briefly on each one of those. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jamaica.
Thanks. Next slide, please, Mary Ellen. Excellent. So the scientific panel on contraceptive transitions theories. This ran from 2019 until just last year, 2024. The genesis of this panel came from the Gates Foundation, who proposed the panel as part of an open call from IUSSP for new panels back, I think, in 2018. Why? Well, the foundation has made many major commitments to family planning, focused primarily on low and middle income countries. But as with most donors, most of this funding was for family planning programs and policy, although there was a sizable amount of support for research, but focused really on data collection, data dissemination, availability, and analysis. That said, there was recognition or maybe frustration by some members of the family planning team, and by that I mean two demographers, within the data area of family planning, really about the lack of a well-established theory of change for population-level contraceptive increase. Part of this is just for the field in general, and some related to how we talk about contraceptive prevalence change within the foundation, and how we lack sort of the same language for fertility change or demographic transitions. And this really was a theory of macro-level contraceptive change, not the substantial theory around individual level use or non-use, so the drivers of contraceptive use and programmatic theories of change that do exist. Now, it's worth noting that this is not really a common request for donors to request and then fund. Theory is not of interest to most donors, I think it's fair to say, particularly those that are focused on policy and program implementation. That said, the grant's relatively small scale in terms of funding, the ability to leverage the existing IUSSP scientific panel format, and the very clear exploratory nature facilitated the approval of support for this panel. Mary Ellen, next slide, please. So the mandate at the highest level was to review and critique and ideally to synthesize a theory of contraceptive change, again, at the population level, a theory really to help explain macro level changes in contraceptive prevalence. That's the mandate for the panel. The donors often have their own interest, and that's something that's really important to cover and to make clear as we were both devising and undertaking the project. And in this case, the donor's objective is to support family planning research, data research and analysis that could be considered global goods rather than necessarily directly implementable at the program level. Although ultimately and indirectly, every donor wants to have information that can inform strategic decision making. And in this case, that would be around thinking about family planning funding and programs. So this was a bit of an exercise. Important to articulate this dual objective very clearly in the proposal's project objective. And that's listed here. There's a lot going on. We touched on the expected impacts, contributing to an impactful research agenda. Also the inputs, applying aspects of other established demographic theories. And for the demographers, getting to throw in terms like demographic transition theory and epidemiological transition theory into an otherwise very programmatically focused family planning team was quite exciting. And also the desired output, really working to establish an empirically and demographically based theory of contraception. So a lot for the project and the panel, making the panel's mandate both very exciting, but also somewhat daunting. Mary Ellen, next slide.
Yeah, and here we are. This was ISSP scientific panel. We had the title Contraceptive Transition Theories. And you'll see the members of the panel are listed on the right here. There were 8 in total, some distribution around the globe. Just to say, the panel launched its work just right before the pandemic. So we had planned a number of in-person meetings, and those largely did not occur. But the panel was very active. We met for a couple of years. We met monthly via Zoom. So, and credit to everyone on the panel. Everyone made a contribution. Next slide.
So again, contraceptive transition theory, underlined and bolded. I think within the panel, we couldn't say that to ourselves enough, partly because theory is admittedly an uncomfortable place for many demographers, including many of us on this panel. We certainly have experience with it, but it's not necessarily our strong point or most natural home for a lot of the work that we do. In fact, in the Sawadogo et al. Essay that you'll see in this collection, I thought they did a great job of eloquently accusing, I would say, demography of having outsourced much of its theoretical work, particularly around contraceptive use. So this gave a clear charge to the panel. Our aim was to look to and attempt to articulate an overarching theory of change for contraceptive use, again, at the population level. The aim was to devise a conceptual framework that could talk about how, but also why, the use of modern contraception increases from low to high rates across populations in contemporary settings. It's important to note that the principal outcome of interest here was the transition to high contraceptive prevalence. We really sought to understand the factors that drive contraceptive transitions, but not the consequences of this phenomenon or of contraceptive use. This is important because the impact of contraceptive use has really been the primary focus of research on contraception, and in particular of a justification for family planning programs. I think we're all familiar with the slogan, family planning saves lives, or much of the work on the impact of contraceptive use on maternal and child health outcomes. And that was specifically not our focus, and something we kind of had to return to given how ingrained that is in a lot of contraceptive and family planning research. The aim was also to develop a theory based on existing empirical literature, not to undertake new analysis. And in particular, the panel felt really strongly that our work required taking a neutral stance on whether contraceptive transition is desirable or beneficial. We were aiming for a descriptive theory, not prescriptive findings on how to achieve or accelerate a contraceptive transition. And again, that's much of the language in family planning and certainly contraceptive research, and particularly that which is program-based. So we counter to a lot of that research. And I would say arguably counterintuitive for many of us, we really wanted to focus on the neutrality and the sort of observational approach to defining, looking at, and studying contraceptive transitions. Next slide. So all this leads us to the question of what is a contraceptive transition? It seems intrinsically understandable to many of us, but we figured early on we really needed to define a contraceptive transition. And we wrestled quite a bit with the terms of reference around this definition. What does it mean to say that you go from low to high contraceptive prevalence? How do we operationalize this for the panel's work? After, not just some, but I would say a lot of back and forth, we eventually settled as a panel on the following parameters: a focus on modern contraceptive prevalence specifically, and a definition of low as less than 10% contraceptive prevalence, modern contraceptive prevalence, to rates of greater than 60% contraceptive prevalence. And the focus was really on recent transitions, primarily in low and middle income countries. And a lot of this decision really was data-driven. There is lots of quality data on modern contraceptive use across many lower and middle income countries, thanks in large part to DHS, mix, PMA, and other survey data that's simply not available for more historic time periods and not as available for non-modern methods. Now, there was quite a bit of debate around considering other more multidimensional definitions of contraceptive transition that would look beyond contraceptive use per se. The family planning and sexual and reproductive health fields are really moving away from just contraceptive use or modern contraceptive prevalence as a primary outcome measure and looking to more comprehensive family planning or reproductive health measures and indicators. Some that have been proposed or in process are contraceptive autonomy, thinking around contraceptive equity, measures of satisfaction, among others. And this is really an important movement and transition that we wanted to make sure to account for. That said, the panel ultimately decided to maintain the focus again on modern contraceptive prevalence, due primarily to, again, these data constraints, partly in terms of which data is available and also looking at the sort of demographic nature of our work. Contraceptive prevalence is a measurable and comparable outcome that would allow us to look across countries and across time periods. Many of these newer concepts and measures, though important, they're not fully validated, and more importantly, they do lack the data for any sort of comparison over time and space that we felt was really critical for looking at and explaining trends over time for this theory development. The panel does fully expect that future research will incorporate and look at other dimensions around contraception, and that's likely to yield more refined conceptualization and definitions of contraceptive transition. But for the purposes of our work, we wanted to stick to a tighter definition around modern contraceptive prevalence and looking again from low to high in a specific set of countries. Next slide.
Yeah, so following from what Jamaica's been saying about the work of the panel, there was a distinct evolution. We started with an ambition to submit, after a few years of work, a unified explanatory framework. Really would be a new framework for the field. It would be comprehensive, multidisciplinary, and informed by the enormous amount of research that's been conducted on contraception now for a bunch of decades. But after wrestling with this, trying to figure out how we had achieved this ambition, we soon realized this was simply not feasible and probably not the best use of the time and resources of the panel and those other scholars we could involve. So we decided our goal would be to move in some new directions, to solicit and produce a set of essays that tried to push the boundaries a bit, incorporate new evidence, new perspectives from different scientific disciplines. So that's what we believe we've achieved. I'll say early on, we had a series of virtual workshops. We invited a set of scholars to share their ideas, kind of a brainstorming about how we might offer something new and fresh, new approaches, new ideas. And those workshops were quite influential in forming later choices of topics and themes for essays. Next slide. So here's the cover. This was published by PDR in December online. It's entirely online. There's going to be no hard copy, but it is open access. It's fully open access. All essays are open access, and this is something we badly wanted to achieve. 8 essays in total. Next slide will show the contents, but there's a first one by Kantorova and Bongard that's kind of a descriptive backdrop, you could say. And then 7 distinct essays and you'll see the list, and we'll highlight a few of them during the rest of this presentation that delve into certain perspectives, certain issues around contraceptive transition. These are review essays. They synthesize and critique existing scholarship. They don't provide new analysis of data. And we do believe there's some theoretical creativity in this collection of essays. We're feeling some pride in what we were able to accomplish eventually after some years of work. Next slide. Here it is. I won't dwell on this slide, just to say here's a full table of contents. You can very easily go to the PDR website and find the same. And the remainder of today's presentation, we're going to take highlights from a few of these essays. Well, about half of them are going to be in the remainder of our presentation. Next slide. So for today, we have drawn out from these this set of eight essays, three themes that weave through not more than one of them. The first one is there a contraceptive transition theory that's distinct from fertility transition theory? The second is how do we explain different pathways to contraceptive transition? The empirical data show that there have been some distinct pathways. And the third is, does demography as a discipline, some of us think of demography as a discipline, does it contribute anything distinctive to contraceptive transition theory? So we'll touch briefly on each one of these. Next slide. So how is contraceptive transition theory different from fertility transition theory? Does it merit its own theory? Or is it easily and comfortably subsumed in a theory of fertility transition? Well, this is a question the panel wrestled with from the beginning through to the end. We expect a theory of contraceptive transition must be fairly tightly connected to theory of fertility transition. How could it be otherwise? Contraception is primarily about avoiding pregnancy. Still, one can ask, are there aspects of contraceptive change that require distinct and focused theory? So we asked authors to extent they were comfortable and able to address this question, and several of them did address it directly. Next slide. So in the Sawadogo et al., actually this essay more than any of the others confronts this question. The authors review a selection of empirical studies on contraception. It's almost 150 studies that they selected. And they draw from this some interesting conclusions. First of all, the contraceptive theory is almost entirely derivative of fertility theory. And I guess that's not surprising. But actually, and this probably won't surprise most of you online today, theory hardly figures in most of these studies. The authors figure that about 75, about 3/4 of these studies moved to the empirical analysis with almost no theoretical discussion. And where there is theory referenced, it's mainly economic and cultural theories. So the author's takeaway is that, I'll quote them, demography can reclaim some of the turf in theoretical analysis of population outcomes, including contraception. So it's kind of a call to arms for demography. And the authors pursue this assignment very creatively, and that will be discussed a little bit later in today's session by Nathalie Sawadogo. Now, another essay by Sarah Yateman and Christy Sennett. This essay is about fertility desires, fertility preferences, how this figures in contraceptive change. And they, in this essay, you will find a framework. I've copied it in here as a figure. It's in the lower right of this slide. It's heavily derived from Easterlin. This is explicitly a framework for contraception, not fertility more generally. So it contains elements, if you spend a bit of time with this figure, contains elements you would not necessarily find in a piece on fertility per se. And while it's not purely macro level framework, it's certainly multi-level. Systems and institutions figure into this framework. Further, one of the author's main conclusions is highly pertinent to contraception as an outcome. They note that family size desires have plateaued, even as contraceptive use has increased, which suggests that implementation of fertility desires is an important factor to have in mind in understanding contraceptive transitions. And that's a kind of a consideration that must figure prominently in contraceptive transition research that wouldn't necessarily figure very prominently in research on fertility transition. Next slide. Finally, we have an essay by Mahesh Kara and Josh Wild on what economic theory has to contribute to contraceptive transition theory. And they very helpfully identify mechanisms through which economic development would affect contraception specifically rather than fertility more generally. They provide a review, a synopsis of theories of economic theory about fertility change, going back to Becker and Easterlin. And it's I think you will find the Karen Wild review quite helpful resource, and I suggest you take a look at it if you're looking for a nice, concise synopsis of economic theory. They do have a interesting argument where they claim that standard economic theory is incomplete when it comes to contraceptive transitions. It fails to recognize that contraceptive demand can be independent of fertility demand. And they note at least 3 ways in which this can be the case. One is that income effects on contraception can be somewhat independent of income effects on fertility, particularly the ability to purchase contraception. Secondly, there's a question of sexuality, sexual partnerships, the demand for sex, which absolutely bears on contraception, maybe has features less in fertility theory. And finally, that contraceptive use can be motivated by non-fertility goals, especially health, issues of health, contraception used for health purposes. Next slide, and I'll turn it back to Jamaica.
Second theme to really emerge from the collective set of essays here that we wanted to touch on was a question that came early in the panel's work, really asking about whether there are different pathways to contraceptive transition and how do these different pathways come about. Again, from the outset, and I think it's fairly obvious, the panel was aware of considerable cross societal and population variation in what would be the contraceptive transition, different pathways of going from low to high modern contraceptive prevalence. It was really important to develop some understandings of some of those country-specific patterns and to consider whether there was a wide range of these pathways to contraceptive transition. We made that one of our goals early on. So these pathways can include several ways in which contraceptive transitions can differ. One, which is a nice overview from Kantarova and Bongartz in their descriptive overviews around the timing and pace. We see a lot of variation in contemporary contraceptive transitions, and the data suggests a number of different pathways related to how fast and when these transitions occur. There's also a lot of different determinants around what brings about a contraceptive transition. A large range of candidates, too many to go into now, but we know that research really suggests, unsurprisingly, that there's a mix, and it varies quite a bit from one society to the next. So a good indication that we would see a fair amount of differential pathways. And while there wasn't a specific focus in the panel or in our requests to authors or workshops on a deep dive into the differential pathways, we did urge authors to be attentive to this, and aspects of several of the essays, 2 of which we'll cover here, do speak directly to this issue. Next slide, please. The first is a paper on health transitions and the rise of modern contraceptive prevalence that I co-authored with Anne Biddlecombe, Jalal Abbasi-Shabasi, Alex Eze, and Rodolfo Gomez Ponce de Leon, and I do want to mention them because I know at least some are on this call. And this was an overview, a high-level overview of how health transitions may condition contraceptive transitions, and a particular emphasis on the mechanisms of action. At the highest level, we looked first at child mortality, how reductions in child mortality motivated contraceptive use, and that's pretty universal. We see that in almost every population that we look at. And then we wanted to look second and focus a bit more then on aspects of healthcare related to health transitions, specifically how healthcare expansion and or how healthcare organization can alter major barriers that exist to contraceptive use. And that is much more context specific, looking at the implementation of expansion and organization and healthcare approaches in different countries to see how those may have interacted with or led to encouraged contraceptive transitions. We give a couple of country-specific examples, sort of from the literature that support this theoretical approach. One example is healthcare delivery and how that can facilitate healthcare delivery independent of family planning programs, can and has been shown to increase contraceptive uptake. A good example of this was the expansion of primary healthcare into the rural areas of Iran and how the associated correlations of rise of contraceptive use with that healthcare push. We also found we also explored policies not related to family planning, more general healthcare policies that may be directly related to contraceptive transition in terms of method mix, in particular dominant methods that came around as part of the transition. An interesting example here was looking at Brazil and considering how the high rates of cesarean section delivery, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, that were the result of higher reimbursements, higher financial incentives for C-sections, led to higher rates of female sterilization, as most sterilizations were performed during or following cesarean sections, and the substantial increase in C-sections correlated with and drove the dominance of sterilization in the method mix for a certain period of time. So again, non-family planning specific policies that led to family planning specific outcomes from overall healthcare implementation. We ultimately conclude from the literature that the evidence does suggest that the health transition has likely played a decisive role in the rise of modern contraception in many contemporary settings. And how these health transitions unfold impacts how contraceptive transitions unfold. I think we were surprised and maybe somewhat delighted when taking on a topic that has been largely underexplored, due in large part to the focus on the opposite causality. There's a lot of work, again, on the impact of contraceptive use on health outcomes, as mentioned earlier, particularly how contraceptive use shows up in maternal and child health outcomes. And this has led to a lack of consideration of the other directionality between these two transitions. We believe this calls for a revisiting of some seminal studies on family planning program, including Matlab in Bangladesh and Navrongo in Ghana, to reassess, maybe reconsider how broader shifts in healthcare provision or rollout, particularly maternal and child healthcare elements that were part of the overall project design, how these compared to specific family planning specific interventions, and how they may have contributed differently to the increases in contraceptive prevalence in these settings that have long been contributed to family planning specific interventions. Next slide. I also want to touch briefly on Matthias Lerch's paper on societal upheaval and the contraceptive transition. Really a delightful paper that looks at or asks, whether societal upheavals affect the trajectories of contraceptive transitions. These are really acute crises, societal crises such as armed conflict, looking at natural disasters, pandemics, crises that are unfortunately all too common, but that do give us many examples to pull from. So the question really was on the balance, do these social upheavals derail or accelerate the contraceptive transition? They can derail them due to challenges, increasing challenges to contraceptive use and adherence during these crises. They can also accelerate them if there's increased demand for or use of contraception as a result of or in response to social crises or upheaval. Lerch also asks the questions around what are the pathways that determine the direction and the intensity of the impact on contraceptive transition. So perhaps not surprisingly, Lerch does find a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of variation depending on context and crises. That said, he does find that there's more pathways that lead to reduced contraceptive prevalence in response to societal upheaval. A lot of this is existing barriers. A lot of recognized barriers to contraceptive use become even more salient in times of crises, challenging again use and adherence. But he also notes that barriers to contraceptive use around access or availability, for example, that have previously been overcome tend to reemerge during these societal crises. He concludes tentatively, but I think a pretty strong conclusion nonetheless, that societal upheavals generally do cause at least a temporary setback in the contraceptive transition. So yes, societal upheavals and crises likely do affect contraceptive transition trajectories and impact the pathways. And I thought that was a really, even though that wasn't the stated objective of the paper, it matched really nicely with this theme as we were able to pull across the papers. So with that, and in the interest of time, next slide, and I will hand off to Nathalie Sawadogo, who will talk about demography's contribution to the contraceptive transition theory.
Oui, merci. Merci, Jamaica. Alors, vous avez déjà donné un aperçu du sujet qu'on a traité dans notre article avec mes co-auteurs. Je voulais juste attirer l'attention sur deux aspects que nous trouvons essentiels dans les apports de cet article-là. Alors, un des principaux aspects que nous voulions montrer, c'est que, en fait, au-delà des facteurs économiques et culturels qui sont souvent évoqués dans les explications des transitions contraceptives, et bien sûr, généralement en lien avec celle de la fécondité, la démographie peut beaucoup améliorer notre compréhension de cette transition-là en mettant en avant essentiellement trois concepts et qui sont usuels aux trois niveaux habituels d'analyse. En premier, on a les effets au niveau micro qui font ressortir le rôle des événements du parcours de vie de l'individu. Et là, nous avons estimé que l'utilisation d'une perspective démographique permet de faire ressortir le rôle actif des événements au niveau micro, notamment par exemple au niveau individuel, l'âge au premier rapport sexuel, qui peut être très variable selon les environnements et qui peut beaucoup influencer la pratique contraceptive. Au niveau méso, au niveau de l'influence de la génération, on a mis en évidence, notamment, on le voit dans les travaux d'Sterling, que l'impact de la dynamique générationnelle est important du point de vue économique. Et ce que nous voulions montrer aussi, c'est que d'un point de vue démographique, l'impact d'une génération découle aussi de son comportement spécifique en fonction de son histoire, de son environnement, de ses spécificités et aussi de sa taille relative par rapport à l'ensemble de la population. Alors, notre réflexion nous amène à suggérer que dans l'analyse des facteurs des transitions contraceptives, on essaye de davantage tenir compte de la manière dont le comportement, la taille, le renouvellement des cohortes successives peuvent façonner les tendances de l'utilisation des contraceptifs au niveau de la population. Diapo, s'il te plaît, Marie-Hélène. OK. Alors, au niveau macro, là, on s'intéresse plus au rôle de la structure de la population qui peut influencer effectivement la prévalence de la contraception à travers notamment les aspects plus macro comme la structure par âge et la structure du parcours de vie des femmes. Et notamment, quand on s'intéresse au parcours de vie des femmes, ce serait intéressant de tenir compte de la proportion de la durée de vie qui est consacrée à la reproduction en lien avec la production économique et comment est-ce que ça s'articule dans la vie des femmes. Diapo, s'il te plaît. OK. Ensuite, le deuxième élément que nous avons voulu mettre en exergue, c'est comment est-ce que l'utilisation des outils d'analyse démographique tels que les méthodes de décomposition peut aider à améliorer la compréhension des dynamiques d'un point de vue démographique. Et notamment, elle permet de clarifier les tendances au niveau de la population en faisant la distinction entre les effets comportementaux au niveau individuel et les effets plus macro de composition. Et on sait que les effets individuels peuvent être liés effectivement, comme on l'a vu dans les travaux précédents, à des facteurs économiques et culturels, tandis que les effets de composition peuvent plus mettre en exergue les structures démographiques qui sont sous-jacentes et qui ne sont souvent pas prises en compte. Voilà, après ces quelques mots, je laisse la parole à John pour dire un mot sur les autres articles. Diapo, s'il te plaît, Marie-Hélène, and the floor is yours, John.
Thank you, Natalie. Well, we're almost at the end of our presentation. We've touched on 5 of the 8 essays in this collection. Here are 3 that we haven't reviewed, although the Cantrova and Bongart's we've referred to several times. And I should say the other 5 we by no means given a complete summary of their contents, just extracted a few tastes here and there. Next slide. So just some final thoughts, and then we'll turn to the discussant and open discussion. Some final thoughts about the challenge of doing theory. Here, I may be speaking more for myself than the panel as a whole, although I suspect most members of the panel would agree with this slide. Theory development is hard work. It's maybe harder than you think until you try to do it. And especially if you're aiming for some innovation, say something new. When it comes to contraception, we've had, let's say, 5 decades of rigorous research, rigorous thinking about contraceptive change. So saying something new is a tough agenda. And if you are trying to achieve multidisciplinarity, this makes it harder. There are benefits, of course, but we know across discipline that concepts and terminology vary. There are different intellectual legacies. And then simply the practical task of assembling a team from multiple disciplines that can function effectively together. There are a lot of practical obstacles, reflecting in part the different concepts, different disciplinary legacies. Finally, as what we've contributed in this collection of essays, we feel we've pushed out the boundaries a bit from the existing canonical frameworks. One thinks especially of Becker and Easterlin. Across the 8 essays, there's new streams of scholarship that appear in these essays, scholarship that's emerged during the last few decades. So you'll find that in these essays. And the essays are more encompassing of the historical experience of the last few decades. Easterlin, Becker formulated their frameworks a long time ago. And since then, there's been a lot of societal experiences, some of which depart, which have eccentricities that weren't expected or anticipated in those kind of canonical frameworks. So I think our essays are attentive to the experience we've all observed over the last few decades, and as appropriately so. Next slide. So just to make a few quick acknowledgments, Gates Foundation allowed this panel to function and to produce this collection of essays. ISSP, as always, provided superb support from Paris. Population Development Review, I want to say, was wonderful to work with. Rachel Friedman, the managing editor, and their team, very constructive folks to work with and very skilled. And then finally, there are the other members of this panel, the 3 of us here today, but there are 5 others listed in this last bullet point. And we thank them for their work over a whole number of years. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to our discussant.
Thank you so much. So I'm Heini Vaïsänen from INED, and I have been asked by Marie-Hélène to discuss this presentation today. I wanted to start by saying congratulations to the panel for this amazing amount of work that was done in this panel. I think it is quite a challenging task actually to discuss this, because there's so much that went into this that where do you even start from? But I will try to grasp on some things. And I also would like to say that I very much admire you for like stepping to the outside of our normal comfort zone and into theory, which is not always easy given the training that most demographers have. Before I go on to my discussion, I would like to start with a disclaimer. So I wasn't unfortunately able to read all of these 8 essays before doing this discussion, but I will hope to read them in the future. In terms of where I'm coming from, I'm very much, I've spent my career studying sexual and reproductive health and rights, but I'm not necessarily a specialist on contraception as such. And I'm also coming from a kind of feminist point of view who is really keen on reproductive justice framework, which you have explicitly excluded here. So I hope you won't be too frustrated with some of my comments. And I also hope that this discussion won't be too disjointed, as I got a lot of ideas when I was listening to you. So I will have a lot of notes on the margins as well. But yeah, I mean, like overall, it's not like it was also difficult to discuss this because this is obviously excellent work done by a lot of leading scholars in the field. So I feel like there isn't that much to critique here. So I wanted to start with, I understand the desire to focus on something simple that can be measured, especially since there was no like new data collection or anything like that that came with this panel. I wanted to ask you about, like at the beginning, you said that you wanted to take a neutral stance on whether contraceptive transition is desirable or beneficial. And I wanted to ask, how did you do that? It seems to me that it's incredibly difficult to be neutral about these things. Did you discuss this? Did you have did you check in with the panel? Or how did you go about making sure that kind of our biases don't creep into what we are doing? Especially, I think a couple of times the word theory of change was mentioned. And I think often in theory of change, we kind of start with some outcomes that we think are desirable, which kind of sounds like they would not be neutral. So I would like to hear a bit more about the panel's thoughts on that. I also was wondering like how the panel members were chosen. I'm not saying that there was anything wrong with the members chosen, but it was just interesting to know more about that process and how you think that the composition that you ended up with, maybe did that affect somehow what the eventual output then was. In terms of the definition of high contraceptive use, which was 60%, and kind of like taking some elements of what was said at the end of like how demography can contribute by, for instance, thinking about the population structure a bit more. I was wondering if what is high contraceptive use also depends on like, not just like who is in reproductive age, but also the composition of the population in reproductive age. So are there lots of very young or like more like adolescent women there, or is it more towards the 30s and early 40s type of population? Then I have a question about kind of like is the distinct theory possible or needed section / the introduction. So I think you said, you didn't want to take, at this point, it would have been too complicated to take reproductive justice theory or the reproductive justice into account. But then some of the things that were explored and discussed in this presentation was, for instance, economic theories. So that obviously takes a certain stance and focuses measurement and knowledge production to certain questions. And I was just wondering, because you said that in the future it might be possible to include other views. So how would you go about pivoting from this type of measurement and knowledge production into a more comprehensive and more rights-focused one? In terms of the section about different pathways, I think that was fascinating, and especially the Jamaica's and colleagues' paper on healthcare policies and healthcare changes. But again, I think here it would be very important to think about, people's desires and experiences in the healthcare system, especially what happened in Faso and like how does that affect people's well, I start from the third section again. So what does demography has to offer? So I wanted to ask you how you define theory and how do you define demography and how does that then maybe tell us? Because I mean, like for some people, demography is very empirical, and for some people, theory is very not connected at all to empirical questions. And it seems to me that you were very much starting from the empirical data that we have. What can we measure? And how does that then turn into theory? So I would like to kind of hear your thoughts on those concepts. Then maybe I have some more thoughts, but just in interest of time, one more point only. So this time the focus was very much on modern contraception, but I was wondering if at some point in the future traditional methods will be also included, because also like in some context, maybe the interplay between traditional and modern methods could say something interesting about, what type of methods people are using and why. Thank you so much.
Over to John, Jamaica, and Nathalie. You have about, it looks like maybe 10 minutes, and then I have to make one announcement at the end. So, floor is to you.
Well,
and
we maybe want to allow for some questions from the floor. I'm not sure among the three of us how we're going to divide up the response. Heini's raised a lot of really interesting questions that would, full discussion would go for hours, I think. I'll address one thing, and I think a couple of these are kind of obvious for Jamaica and Nathalie. It's a question about neutrality, about, that we viewed ourselves having a neutral stance about whether contraceptive transition is a good thing, a beneficial societal outcome. I'll just say I think we didn't actually wrestle with that in any length. It was just kind of assumed that was part of our mandate, not to get into the whole matter of what are the payoffs to societies, to individuals, to having higher levels of contraceptive use. But I think it's also the case, and maybe my colleagues would disagree, that if you read through the essays, it's kind of implicit in most of them that increasing contraception is by and large a good thing, especially to the extent that it is responsive to individuals' desires about their childbearing. So a lot of hedge on, what are the obstacles to increase? How does increase come about? I would say weaving through all that, implicitly underlying it is an assumption that it's essentially a good thing. But that point is never made explicitly or directly, and certainly not by the panel. Let I don't know if that's responsive, Heini, but that's what I would say. Jamaica and Nathalie, you want to make any responses here?
I'll step in a bit. I think that we did just, as you said, John, decide, to take a neutral perspective early as we're seeking to understand contraceptive transitions. And, in contrast to a lot of family planning, reproductive health work or contraceptive work that is focused on, if not increasing use, increasing aspects of use. We wanted to step away from that so that this didn't bleed into a lot of the, more either programmatic or reproductive health specific research goals and outcomes. And I think it was a bit of a challenge just to remind ourselves that we're not looking to encourage contraceptive transitions, that not looking to increase or accelerate, which is, in direct contradiction to a lot of programming language, accelerating contraceptive uptake, increasing contraceptive prevalence. And I think in some of our workshops and discussions, there is that implicit work, and I, in several points, found us moving as a panel and more generally in that direction. I think we did have to rein ourselves in occasionally and say, we're not talking about the factors or variables of individual level use. We really want to take a step back and look at this without having a vested interest, so to speak, in what the end goal would be. And so it wasn't difficult, but it was something we had to, I think, be aware of throughout this work, just given the current and more dominant approaches of a lot of the fields that we were pulling from and their perspective on contraceptive use.
Oui, ce que je pourrais ajouter, c'est que par rapport à la question sur l'aboutissement à une théorie, comme on l'a dit, ça n'a vraiment plus été l'objectif à un certain moment de nos travaux, mais c'était plutôt d'apporter des clés de lecture. de ce qui se passe en termes de dynamique et de transition contraceptive en essayant de tenir compte de tout ce qui pouvait être utile comme dimension et avec la clé de lecture également et des analyses et de la réflexion de la pensée démographique. Donc, ce n'est vraiment pas l'objectif ultime d'aboutir à une théorie unique, tellement les dynamiques contraceptives répondent à des facteurs et à des dimensions totalement variables et qui peuvent être très spécifiques selon les environnements, selon les individus. Merci.
Vous avez deux questions. You have two questions one from Terry Hull on, he says, transition is inherently over time. Have you considered changes in contraceptive technologies? Also the changes in structures, functions, and budgets of family planning programs. And there's a second question, and then I'll leave it. Can a neutral stance on contraceptive transition overlook the power dynamics at play, specifically if transition becomes state-driven and potentially used as tools to control fertility and violate bodily autonomy? And that's from Saroja Adhikari. So those are the two questions from the audience.
Well, I'll say on Terry's question about technology, in fact, at one point we had hoped to have an essay that focused a lot on technology, and this actually gives me an opportunity to recognize Susanna Cavanacci, who is in today's session as a co-editor with myself of the PDR supplement. And actually, Susanna will say, I'll speak for her. I should let her speak for herself, but felt strongly we needed to have more attention to contraceptive technology. So I would take that as not entirely absent from the volume, but an important feature that we perhaps deserve more play, because it has been, the last 5-6 decades have seen some really revolutionary advances in contraceptive technology. As for family planning programs, the second part of Terry's question, we have a whole essay by Jocelyn Finley that reviews evidence on program impacts on contraceptive use. So we think of that as an up-to-date. There have been such reviews periodically over the decades, and Jocelyn's essay offers an update with an emphasis on the RCTs, the quasi-experiments that have occurred over the last few decades. And then, right, maybe I'll stop with that.
Mary Ellen, I know we're conscious of time, so I was going to rapid fire a few responses to Heini because I really appreciated the discussion and thought you raised a lot of good points, not all of which we'll address here, but we'll certainly take into account. Your question on how the panel was chosen and did it impact the eventual outcome? I mean, I think yes, every panel has an influence on the final product, but the panel was chosen, I think, with the guiding principles, I believe, of IUSSP, of the 3 Gs. Gender, geography, and generation. And we really attempted to meet those 3 parameters as much as possible. And I think that makes for a really interesting panel. It's not simply the sort of usual suspects or people who already know one another are working together. And I think that really strengthened the panel. We also did a number of workshops, invited many other authors, not just for the issue we're talking here, but for many of the previous workshops. And that certainly helped to push our thinking and increase the likelihood of really accounting for different perspectives. For your question on taking reproductive justice into account, but not taking it into account, but looking at other areas. I mean, I think the short answer, and we could spend a whole session discussing just this, but that just leads into a very different line of consideration and questioning, and there's so much going on in the reproductive justice research and policy arenas that we felt we really had to put some guardrails around what we were going to look at so as not to lose focus and lose sight of what we wanted to investigate and make our way into not more interesting, but just as interesting and more timely debates in those areas. And then for the last, I'm combining a couple questions here. We didn't really look at traditional methods, partly because those transitions are much more historic. We have some data, but much less, as well as a lot of the issues around reporting and accounting for traditional method use that's still prevalent in most surveys and research approaches. And we're looking at, to Terry's question, some of these technologies, the technologies of modern contraception and the sort of rise of the family planning programs and availability of modern use really influenced the decision to focus specifically on modern modern contraception. There's a question in the chat about the issue of the neutral stance, and does it overlook power dynamics or using contraception as a tool to control fertility? To some degree, taking a neutral stance and just describing a lot of these transitions does do that. Likewise with fertility transition. We know that there are transitions that have occurred under duress, and we still want to describe them. We're not condoning. And again, going back to that neutral stance, not saying that, not taking the perspective that contraceptive transitions should happen and that they're, necessarily beneficial, but incorporating, I think some of those aspects could have been done more directly. We kind of, I think, skirted over where there's issues of questions around autonomy or coercion. And those certainly exist, but I think those fall into a different category and one that should be addressed separately.
Okay. I think you've got a few more. One other question about the S-curve.
S-curve. Quick answer is we didn't explicitly try to figure that out. It came into our discussion here and there, but the short answer is we don't agree or disagree. I think you could look at the Kantarova and Bongart's descriptive analysis of contraceptive transitions, and there may be some insight there about the S-curve, although I don't think they also explicitly try to figure that out. I will also take this opportunity to say quickly, I think the question about power dynamics, really important question, and that operates at a lot of levels. And I think actually it is a kind of an oversight in this volume that we didn't give enough attention to that matter.
Yeah, I thank all of our speakers. I'm really glad to hear the outcome of the panel on contraceptive transition theories, and a big thanks to John, Nathalie, and Jamaica, and Heini for being the discussant.